High above the sun-drenched landscape of Sicily, the air is thin and cold. The roar of dozens of Wright cyclone engines, a symphony of mechanical fury, pounds in the ears of the bomber crews. They are North American B-25 Mitchells, silverbirds heavy with purpose, their bomb bays pregnant with destruction for the Axis airfield below. Flying alongside them, a protective shield of smaller, more nimble aircraft, are their escorts. These are the shepherds, the guardians tasked with fending off the wolves. But these aren't just any shepherds. They fly in Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, tough and rugged fighters, but already a step behind the latest predators of the sky. And the men inside them are not just any pilots. They are the 99th Fighter Squadron. They are an experiment. To many in the high command, they are an experiment that is expected to fail. On the ground, in the halls of power, in briefing rooms and strategy sessions, reports have been written and opinions solidified. A 1925 Army War College study, a document steeped in the prejudice of its era, declared that the African American was careless, shiftless, irresponsible, and secretive. It concluded they were simply not suited for the complexities of combat, let alone the cockpit of a modern fighter plane. The military was a segregated institution, a reflection of the nation it served, and it was structured on this bedrock of prejudice. Black sailors were largely confined to roles as mess men. The Air Corps and the Marines excluded them entirely. Yet, here they are. They are the embodiment of a relentless political and social pressure campaign waged by civil rights leaders, black newspapers, and advocates who demanded the right to fight for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. They are the product of Tuskegee, Alabama, a place where they trained under immense scrutiny, with washout rates significantly higher than their white counterparts, forging them into an elite, if untested, cadre. They are fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Axis powers, and another against the deeply entrenched discrimination of their own side. This was the Double V campaign: victory against fascism abroad and victory against discrimination at home. And on this day, July 2nd, 1943, one of those pilots, a young man who carries the weight of these expectations on his shoulders, will find himself in the right place, at the right time, to fight both wars at once. On July 2nd, 1943, a German ace, a master of the skies in his Focke-Wulf 190, was hunting American bombers. He was confident, skilled, and completely unaware that he was being stalked. Above him, in a P-40 Warhawk, was a pilot his own commanders had deemed racially incapable of flying in combat. In the next few seconds, a 22-year-old from Indiana wouldn't just shoot down an enemy plane, he would shoot down a myth. Charles Blakesley Hall was born on August 25, 1920, in the small town of Brazil, Indiana. The son of Franklin and Anna Hall, he was a bright and athletic young man who stood out on both the football field and the track. He was driven, with a quiet intensity that pushed him to enroll at Eastern Illinois State Teachers College to study pre-med. His future seemed set on a path of healing and service. But the world had other plans. The drums of war were beating, and when the call for service came, Hall, like millions of others, answered. He put his medical studies on hold and, in his third year of college, enlisted as an aviation cadet in the Army Air Corps. For any young man, the path to becoming a military aviator was grueling. For a black man in 1941, it was nearly impossible. The very existence of the training program at Tuskegee was a victory born of struggle. Before 1940, the military simply turned away black applicants who dreamed of flying. But tireless lobbying by organizations like the NAACP and the rising voice of the black press forced President Franklin D. Roosevelt's hand. Public Law 18 expanded the Army Air Corps in 1939, and the pressure campaign ensured that this expansion had to include African Americans. The Tuskegee Experiment, as it was dubbed, was established. It was a segregated training program, a concession to the reality of racial division at the time, but it was a crack in the wall of exclusion. When Charles Hall arrived at Tuskegee Army Airfield, he stepped into a pressure cooker. The cadets knew the world was watching, and that many were waiting for them to fail. The training was deliberately harder, the standards uncompromisingly high. Some estimates place the washout rate for cadets at Tuskegee as high as 60%, compared to roughly 40% for their white counterparts at other facilities. This brutal attrition was designed to ensure that only the absolute best would earn their wings. They couldn't just be as good as white pilots. The unspoken demand was that they had to be better. The curriculum was exhaustive, covering everything from flight theory and meteorology to aircraft identification and the grim realities of combat. On July 3, 1942, almost a year to the day before he would make history, Charles Hall pinned on the silver wings of a pilot and became a second lieutenant in the United States Army. He was one of the first 43 African-American pilots assigned to the newly formed 99th Pursuit Squadron. After more training, the squadron shipped out, arriving in North Africa in the spring of 1943. They were finally at the front. But the fight for respect was far from over. Attached to the 33rd Fighter Group, the 99th was isolated by segregation and prejudice. Their group commander, Colonel William Momier, was openly skeptical of their abilities. The battle-hardened white pilots of the group offered little mentorship, leaving the 99th on its own. They were flying the Curtiss P-40L Warhawk. The P-40 was a workhorse, a tough, heavily armed fighter that could absorb an incredible amount of punishment. But it was an aging design, heavier and less powerful than the premier German fighters it would face, particularly the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. While many P-40s carried 6.50 caliber machine guns, the L variant often had 4 to save weight and improve performance. Its key advantage was its ruggedness and superior turning ability at lower altitudes. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could be a deadly opponent, but it offered little room for error. The squadron saw its first combat in early June 1943, flying missions over the Italian island of Pantelleria. On June 9th, they had their first tangle with the Luftwaffe. In the heat of the moment, some new pilots broke formation to chase the faster German planes. A common rookie mistake, but one that was used against them. They scored no victories, and Colonel Momier's subsequent negative report cast a long shadow, feeding the narrative that the experiment was failing. The pilots of the 99th knew they needed to prove him wrong. They needed a victory. July 2nd, 1943. The sun baked the El Hawaria airfield in Tunisia, shimmering off the metal skins of the waiting aircraft. For First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, it was his 8th combat mission. The target was the Castelvetrano airfield in southwestern Sicily, a key Axis base. The mission was a classic bomber escort. The 99th Fighter Squadron was tasked with protecting a formation of B-25 Mitchells. Their job was to be a shield, to stick close to the slower, vulnerable bombers and fend off any enemy interceptors. For the 99th, under the cloud of Momier's critical report, discipline was everything. As the formation droned across the Mediterranean, Hall was a bundle of focused senses, his eyes constantly scanning the sky for an ambush. The flight to the target was quiet. The bombers reached Castelvetrano, and Hall watched the bombs fall away, followed moments later by eruptions of smoke and dirt from the airfield below. Mission accomplished. But it's in the moments just after the bombs drop that the danger is greatest. As the formation turned for home, the Luftwaffe pounced. 2 Focke-Wulf FW-19s dove out of the sun. The FW-190, known to Allied pilots as the Butcher Bird, was arguably the best radial engine fighter of the war. It was fast, heavily armed, and devastating in a dive, an apex predator now bearing down on the American bombers. The radio crackled. "Bandits!" High. Chaos. The German pilots sliced through the formation, guns blazing. This was the moment Hall had trained for, the first time he had seen the enemy up close. In his own words, he recalled the split-second decisions. "I saw 2 Focke-Wulfs following the bombers just after the bombs were dropped." The Germans were focused on the lumbering B-25s. Hall saw his chance. His duty was to protect those bombers. He jammed the throttle forward, banking his P-40 into a steep turn. "I headed for the space between the fighters and bombers," he later recounted. Here, the P-40's strengths came into play. While the FW-190 was faster, the P-40 could turn tighter. The German pilot, confident in his machine, likely never saw the aggressive maneuver coming. Hall managed to turn inside the Jerries, a classic dogfighting tactic that turned the hunter into the hunted. For a few critical seconds, the shark-mouthed grin of a warhawk filled the German pilot's rearview mirror. Through his gun sight, Hall framed the second FW-190. The range closed. He squeezed the trigger. The P-40 shuddered as its .50 caliber machine guns roared, sending a stream of tracers into the German fighter. "I fired a long burst and saw my tracers penetrate the second aircraft," Hall said. The effect was devastating. Pieces of the FW-190's fuselage tore away as black smoke erupted from its engine. He was turning to the left, but suddenly fell off and headed straight into the ground, Hall observed. A confirmed kill requires witnessing the crash. Hall followed the mortally wounded plane down. "I followed him down and saw him crash," he confirmed. He raised a big cloud of dust. In the sky over Castelvetrano, there was now one less enemy fighter. On the ground below, a myth lay shattered alongside the twisted wreckage. The sky grew quiet again. The surviving FW-190 broke off, and the B-25s reformed for the flight home. First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, his heart still pounding, rejoined the escort. Back at El Hawaria, the news spread like wildfire. Ground crews swarmed Hall's P-40 as he taxied in. He was a hero. In a famous photograph, Hall sits in his cockpit, pointing to the spot on his fuselage where a small swastika would soon be painted. As a small reward from his jubilant squadron, he was handed a bottle of Coca-Cola, a cherished taste of home. This was more than just a single kill. It was the first time in World War II that an African-American pilot flying for the United States had shot down an enemy aircraft. The victory was a thunderclap that echoed up the chain of command. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, traveled to the 99th's headquarters to personally congratulate the squadron on their victory. The moment was a powerful symbol of validation from the very top. For his actions, Charles Hall was promoted to captain and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the first African-American pilot to receive this honor. The black press in the United States erupted with headlines celebrating their hero. However, Hall's victory was the only aerial kill recorded by the 99th for all of 1943. The squadron continued to fly difficult missions, but Colonel Momier's negative report still dogged them. There was even a proposal to remove the 99th from combat and relegate them to coastal patrol. But their commander, the brilliant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., fought for his men. He traveled to Washington to defend his squadron's record, arguing they had performed as well as any new squadron and were hampered by a lack of mentorship. His arguments, bolstered by Hall's undeniable victory, were successful. The 99th stayed in the fight. Hall himself would prove his first kill was no fluke. In January 1944, during the desperate fighting around Anzio, Italy, he shot down 2 more German fighters on the same day, bringing his total to 3. Hall's single act of courage had cracked the dam. Now, the flood was coming. Charles Hall's victory was just the beginning. In early 1944, the 99th Fighter Squadron joined 3 other black fighter squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, to form the all-black 332nd Fighter Group. Under Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., they were transferred to the 15th Air Force and given a new, critical mission: long-range bomber escort. This was the most demanding job a fighter pilot could have, flying deep into enemy territory to protect massive formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers. They were finally equipped with superior aircraft, first the P-47 Thunderbolt, and later the legendary P-51 Mustang. It was with the P-51s that their legend was truly forged. To distinguish their aircraft, the 332nd painted the tails of their Mustangs a vibrant red. This simple act gave them their immortal nickname, the Red Tails. For bomber crews, those red tails became a symbol of salvation. The pilots of the 332nd earned a reputation for their incredible discipline. While some fighter groups broke formation to chase individual glory, the Red Tails were known for staying with the bombers, no matter what. Colonel Davis drilled this tactic into them. The mission wasn't about personal scores. It was about getting the big friends home safely. Bomber crews began to specifically request the Red Tail Angels. Their reputation was built on results. The popular myth that they never lost a bomber isn't strictly true, but the reality is just as impressive. An Air Force report found that the 332nd lost a total of 27 escorted bombers to enemy fighters, compared to an average of 46 for other P-51 groups in the same Air Force. Their combat record was stunning. Flying over 1,500 missions, they destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in the air and another 150 on the ground. In one incredible mission on March 24, 1945, the Red Tails shot down 3 German Me-262 jet fighters in a single day, an unprecedented feat for which the entire 332nd Fighter Group was awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation. The group produced its own heroes. Lee Archer, Joseph Ellsbury, and Edward Toppins were each credited with 4 aerial victories, while Clarence Lester shot down 3 enemy planes in a single mission. These men, once deemed unfit for combat, had become some of the most effective fighter pilots in the European theater. The cost was high. Of the 450 pilots who deployed overseas, 66 were killed in action, and 32 were captured as prisoners of war. The story of Charles Hall and the Tuskegee Airmen is a powerful reminder that history is made by individuals who refuse to accept the limits placed upon them. These pilots fought for a double victory, and their legacy continues to inspire. If you believe stories like this need to be told, help us by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And let us know in the comments, what other overlooked heroes of history deserve to have their story told? When the war ended, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen returned not just as veterans, but as victors. They had confronted the master race ideology of the Nazis and shattered it with skill. They had confronted the systemic racism of their own military and defied it with excellence. Their combat record was undeniable. The group earned over 150 distinguished flying crosses and hundreds of other medals for their service. Their success made the military's segregationist policies indefensible. It was impossible to argue that black men were not capable warriors when a group of them had performed so spectacularly. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen was a key factor that influenced President Harry S. Truman's decision in 1948 to issue Executive Order 9981. The order declared there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. It was the death knell for segregation in the American military, a direct result of the groundwork laid by the men who flew the planes with the red tails. Charles B. Hall, the man who started it all with a burst of machine gun fire over Sicily, returned home a hero, but lived a quiet life. He worked as an insurance agent and later for the Federal Aviation Administration, passing away in 1971 at just 51 years old. For decades, their story was largely unknown to the wider American public. But their legacy endured, and in 2007, the Tuskegee Airmen were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor bestowed by Congress. The story of the German pilot who never saw the P-40 diving from above is more than a tale of a dogfight. It's the story of a 22-year-old pilot from Indiana who, in a few fiery seconds, did more than destroy an enemy aircraft. He helped destroy a lie. He and the hundreds of brave men who followed him proved that courage knows no color. They were the Tuskegee Airmen, and they didn't just win battles in the sky. They won a war for the very soul of a nation. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, the morning began like any other on the Normandy coast. A thin, damp mist hung over the English Channel, muffling the world in a gray stillness. The air was cold, filled with the familiar scent of salt and wet earth. It was just after 5 a.m. Another watch, another day of anxious waiting. But through his binoculars, as the first hint of dawn tried to break the horizon, the sea began to change. It wasn't the tide. It wasn't a weather front. It was something impossible. A dark line had appeared where sea met sky, a smudge that just kept growing, sharpening, and multiplying. This wasn't a fleet. It was a city of steel, a floating metropolis sailing out of the mist and into history. At that moment, before a single Allied soldier set foot on the beaches below, before the world even knew the name Omaha or Utah, he knew. The Reich was about to drown. To understand the shock of that morning, you have to get inside the mindset of Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From the coast of Norway down to the Spanish border, German engineers had built the Atlantic Wall. It was conceived as a chain of concrete and steel, bristling with guns, an impenetrable barrier against any invasion. In the minds of German high command and in the propaganda fed to the soldiers, it was proof of the Reich's power. But Oberleutnant Richter, a professional soldier and a veteran of the Eastern Front, knew the difference between propaganda and reality. At 32, he was old enough to remember a different Germany, and young enough to have been shaped by the furnace of the war. He was pragmatic, observant, and deeply tired. His command was an artillery battery with solid Czech-made cannons, nestled in concrete casements a few miles inland from the beaches the Allies would soon codename Omaha. From his observation post, a concrete bunker sunk into a high bluff, he had a commanding view of the sea. Day after day, he and his men drilled. They calculated firing solutions, maintained their guns, and stared out at the gray, empty water. The talk was always of the invasion, Der Tag X, the day of days. But when would it come? And more importantly, where? German intelligence was certain the main attack would come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest point across the Channel. It was the logical choice. That's where the 15th Army, the bulk of Germany's strength in the West, was waiting. Normandy was considered a sideshow, maybe a spot for a diversion, but not the main event. This was a massive strategic miscalculation, and it was no accident. It was the result of a brilliant Allied deception campaign called Operation Fortitude, and it left the Normandy defenders dangerously exposed. Richter's unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, was better than most in the area. But it was still just a shadow of the elite forces that had conquered France 4 years earlier. It was a mix of seasoned veterans from the East, like himself, and a larger number of very young teenage conscripts and older reservists. They were brave and dutiful, but they weren't the stormtroopers of 1940. They were defenders, tasked with holding a line that was stretched far too thin. The Atlantic Wall itself was more of a patchwork than a solid wall. Many bunkers were incomplete. Minefields had gaps. The vast distances meant even a powerful strongpoint could be isolated and bypassed. Richter knew this. He had seen the shortcuts local farmers still used, the blind spots in the fields of fire. He had a professional skepticism about their chances against a truly determined assault. In the weeks leading up to June, the tension had been a living thing. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with improving the defenses, had been a whirlwind of activity. He ordered millions of mines and thousands of jagged steel obstacles placed on the beaches. The men called them Rommel's asparagus. Rommel understood a truth that the high command in Berlin seemed to ignore. If the Allies weren't defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours, the war in the West would be lost. Allied air power would shred any German reinforcements trying to move to the coast. The first day was the only day that mattered. But on June 5th, the weather turned. A storm blew in with high winds and rough seas. The German Meteorological Office confidently predicted an invasion would be impossible for days. This forecast allowed many senior officers to relax. It was why Rommel himself wasn't even in France. He had gone home to Germany for his wife's birthday. The storm would keep them safe. So as Richter stood watch in the pre-dawn chill of June 6th, the mood was routine. The storm had passed, but the sea was still choppy. No one expected a thing. He was looking east when he first saw it. A flicker. He raised his powerful Zeiss binoculars and focused. His heart, which had been beating in the slow rhythm of a night watch, began to hammer against his ribs. It wasn't a flicker. It was ships, not a patrol, not a raiding party, hundreds of them, and behind them more, and more still. He swept his binoculars left and right. Everywhere he looked, it was the same. The sea was no longer gray water. It was a solid mass of dark, menacing shapes. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. It was the feeling of a man looking at a math problem he could not possibly solve. For a long moment, Richter just couldn't process it. The sheer scale was an insult to logic. German intelligence had estimated the Allies might muster 3,000 vessels for an invasion, and even that would have been a monumental effort. What he was looking at was something else entirely. He tried to count, but it was a fool's errand. His brain, on instinct, began to categorize. He could make out the hulking silhouettes of battleships and cruisers. He saw swarms of smaller, faster destroyers circling them like wolves. And then there were the others, the endless, uncountable others. Landing craft of all shapes and sizes, packed so densely they looked like iron filings drawn to a magnet. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The image didn't change. It only grew clearer as the sun began its slow climb. The official number for the entire operation would later be confirmed at nearly 7,000 vessels, an armada from 8 different nations. It remains the largest amphibious invasion force in history. But to Richter, it wasn't a statistic. It was a physical presence that seemed to bend the horizon. It was a declaration of industrial power so immense that it made everything he'd ever known about warfare obsolete. Germany had built a wall of concrete. The Allies had responded by building a bridge of steel. He grabbed the field telephone, his hand slick with sweat. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4. I have a visual on the channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end was tired, dismissive. "We have reports of a few ships, Oberleutnant. A possible raid. Stand by." "No!" Richter's voice was strained, urgent. "You don't understand. It's not a few ships. It is thousands. The entire sea is covered, from horizon to horizon. This is it. This is the invasion." There was a pause. Disbelief. Richter could almost hear the man picturing him as a hysterical junior officer, spooked by shadows. "Oberleutnant, the sea conditions are not suitable. Our reports show—" "Your reports are wrong," Richter shouted, his voice cracking. "I am looking at it with my own eyes. For God's sake, look at the sea." He slammed the phone down in frustration. It was too big to be believed. He tried another line to regimental headquarters and found his commanding officer. "Richter here. Sir, the invasion fleet is here. 10,000 ships." He knew he was exaggerating, but in that moment, it felt like an understatement. The major's voice was skeptical. "Richter, are you certain?" "The weather." "The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world, Major. And it is sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire." This time, the urgency cut through. The chain of command was paralyzed by a failure of imagination. Their plans, their maps, their intelligence reports, all of it was being erased by the reality floating a few miles away. While Richter was watching the fleet, the high command was focused on reports of parachutists inland, assuming they were the main event. No one was looking at the sea. Richter didn't wait for them. He shouted orders to his men. Roused by the commotion, they stared out from their positions, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. They saw what he saw. The drills were over. This was real. The heavy shells were brought up from the magazines. Rangefinders called out numbers that seemed impossibly large. The giant barrels of the cannons, silent for so long, elevated slowly, pointing their noses toward the impossible fleet. Richter stood in his post, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He could see the landing craft beginning to form up. He could feel the vibration in the air, a low hum of thousands of engines. It was the sound of a superpower breathing, and he was about to throw the first stone. The order finally came just before 6 a.m. Engage at will. For Richter, it was a release. The paralysis of disbelief was broken by the familiar clarity of action. "Fire!" he roared into the telephone. A moment later, the ground trembled as the first gun fired. Then a second, and a third. The shells screamed out over the water. Richter tracked them through his binoculars, a surge of professional pride mixing with his dread. He saw plumes of water erupt in the midst of the fleet. A miss, then another. His men were good. They adjusted their aim, firing with a disciplined rhythm. And for a brief moment, they made their mark. Richter saw a direct hit on an American destroyer, the USS Corey. There was a flash of orange and a puff of black smoke. While some accounts suggest the ship may have also struck a mine, from Richter's perspective, his guns had drawn first blood as the ship listed, crippled, and later sinking. A cheer went up from his men. For a few minutes, it felt like a real battle. It felt like their training mattered. But the feeling was fleeting, because after the quarry was hit, the fleet did not scatter. It didn't slow down. The gap in the formation was simply filled. The endless lines of ships kept coming, an iron tide that couldn't be stopped. His guns fired again and again, but for every one ship they might harass, 100 sailed past untouched. Richter felt a profound sense of futility wash over him. He was a man with a bucket trying to empty the ocean. He looked past his own shell impacts and saw the larger picture. The Allied battleships, ships like the USS Texas, were now turning their massive 14-inch guns toward the shore. Then came the reply. It started as a low rumble from across the water. He saw flashes of light from the big ships, like a silent lightning storm on the horizon. A few seconds later, the air around him began to tear itself apart. The ground began to heave. Geysers of earth erupted from the fields. The systematic industrial process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had begun. Where was the German response? Where were the Panzers? Where was the Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the skies and saw nothing but Allied planes. Fighters, bombers, transports. They owned the air completely. German doctrine called for armored counterattacks, but the closest armored unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was paralyzed by confusion and the need for a direct order from Hitler's headquarters. When it finally did move, it moved without air cover into a sky black with Allied fighter bombers, and it was decimated before it even reached the front. It was in that moment, with his own guns firing and the sky raining steel, that Richter understood. This wasn't a fight. It was an extermination. The Allies weren't trying to outmaneuver him. They were trying to erase him. This single personal realization of overwhelming force defined the entire Normandy campaign. The story of how industrial might eclipsed battlefield tactics is complex and fascinating. If you find these deep dives into the lesser-known perspectives of history compelling, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. It allows us to continue bringing these crucial human stories to light. As the naval bombardment intensified, something in Richter's mind shifted. The tactical part of his brain shut down. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer seeing ships and soldiers. He was seeing the system behind them. He was seeing the factories. Through his trembling binoculars, he looked past the warships and saw, in his mind's eye, the assembly lines of Detroit. He pictured factories churning out trucks and engines on a scale Germany could only dream of. The logistics of this invasion, the ability to supply hundreds of thousands of men on a hostile shore, wasn't a miracle. It was a simple result of that industrial output. He looked at the sky, filled with an endless stream of C-47 transport planes and fighter bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew maybe 300 sorties in all of France. The Allies flew over 14,000. For every one German plane in the sky, there were more than 40 Allied ones. The reason wasn't a failure of German courage. It was the factories. And then there were the tanks. He knew the reputation of the German Panzers. The Tiger and the Panther were technologically superior, feared by Allied crews. But that superiority was a strategic dead end. They were complex, expensive, and difficult to produce. For every fearsome Tiger tank that rolled off the line, the Allies were stamping out dozens of simpler, but brutally effective, Sherman tanks. In the entire year of 1944, the U.S. alone would produce over 29,000 tanks. Germany's peak monthly production, by contrast, never topped 2,000. The Allies weren't planning to win tank battles through quality. They were planning to win by burying the panzers under a mountain of steel. This was the new reality. This was the industrial equation of defeat. All the talk of willpower and ideological strength dissolved in the face of these numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined people could triumph over decadent democracies. But here was the proof that ideology couldn't stop a bomber. Willpower couldn't sink a battleship. Richter felt a profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were good soldiers. They were about to die, not because they were outfought, but because they were outnumbered on a scale that defied comprehension. They were participants in a contest that was already over. He and his men, the entire German army in the West, were like a finely crafted sword facing a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome of the contest was never in doubt. He thought of the propaganda posters and the unshakable belief back home in final victory. It was all a lie, not just a political lie, but a mathematical one. The German High Command must have known. They must have seen the production charts, yet they had sent him and millions of others to fight a war they could not possibly win. It's no wonder that in the war's final year, the psychological strain and the confrontation with this impossible truth led to a rise in suicides among officers on the front lines. They weren't just fighting soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada. They were fighting the full, unrestrained power of the global industrial complex. As the sun climbed higher, the theoretical became a brutal reality. The naval bombardment reached a crescendo, a constant, rolling thunder that never ceased. The concrete of the bunker shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling. Through the observation slit, Richter saw the first waves of landing craft hit the shore. Higgins boats dropped their ramps, disgorging American soldiers into the surf. The machine guns in the German pillboxes along Omaha Beach began to chatter, tearing into the ranks of the first men ashore. From his vantage point, Richter could see the terrible drama unfold, the water turning red, the bodies piling up. The German 352nd Infantry Division was exacting a horrific price. For a moment, it seemed the defense was holding. The Americans were pinned down. But then, the industrial equation asserted itself again. Allied destroyers, seeing the slaughter, did something suicidal and heroic. They steamed directly towards the shore, some closing to within 1,000 yards, scraping their hulls on sandbars. They turned their guns on the German bunkers, providing direct fire support in a move that turned the tide on Omaha. At the same time, strange, new machines began to appear. Richter watched as amphibious trucks, the DUKWs, seemingly drove directly out of the ocean and onto the beach. He saw tanks crawling ashore, some equipped with giant flails to detonate mines. These were Hobart's funnies, specialized armored vehicles the British had developed to overcome exactly these kinds of defenses. The Germans had nothing like them. The scene on the beach below turned from a struggle into a methodical process of annihilation. German strongpoints were systematically blinded and destroyed by naval shells, tank rounds, and bombs. On Omaha Beach alone, estimates suggest the 352nd Division would suffer somewhere around 1,200 casualties that day. A staggering percentage of its fighting force wiped out in a matter of hours. Richter's own battery was now a prime target. Shells landed closer and closer. A direct hit on one of the gun pits sent a fireball into the air. Another gun was knocked out. His telephone lines went dead. He was isolated, his command shattered. He looked up at the sky one last time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the first wave of landing craft was being replaced by a second and a third. Beyond them, the vast armada waited patiently, a conveyor belt of men and material that could, it seemed, run forever. The Allies would land around 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone. The battle for the beach was still raging, but the outcome had already been decided. It was just a matter of time and tonnage. The war in Normandy would rage for another 2 months. The fighting in the hedgerows would be brutal and costly, but it would change nothing. Every German tank destroyed was a loss that could not be replaced. Every Allied tank lost was replaced by 3 more. Every German soldier who fell left a gap in the line that could not be filled. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived that first day, the rest of the war was just an epilogue. They fought on, driven by duty, by fear, or by a patriotism disconnected from reality. But the hope of victory was gone. It had vanished in the dawn light of June 6th. We often picture the end of the Third Reich as a slow, agonizing collapse, culminating in the battle for Berlin. But for the men on the Atlantic Wall, the end came in a single, horrifying moment of revelation. It was the moment they saw a fleet that filled the horizon, a sky black with enemy planes, and a force that was not just an army, but the full, crushing weight of the modern industrial world. It was a new kind of war, one not in the hearts of soldiers, but on the assembly lines of factories thousands of miles away. And for one German officer, peering through his binoculars at a sea that had turned to steel, it was the morning he knew it was over.